Okay, good evening everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Poverty Alliance's 2021 election hustings, A Scotland for All of Us. My name is Fiona Garven. I'm the Director of the Scottish Community Development Centre, but I've also had the honour of being a co-opted member of the Poverty Alliance board. My job tonight is to chair the event, which just basically means keeping everybody to time and asking the questions, and I'll talk through the format of the event just shortly. But before I do that, for those of you who are not already aware, the Poverty Alliance is Scotland's anti-poverty network. We're made up of hundreds of grassroots community organisations, local activists, faith groups, academics and trade unions, all of whom believe in a Scotland free of poverty. Now, the event tonight is taking place at a time when over 1 million people in Scotland are living in the grip of poverty. And we know that with the COVID-19 pandemic, those numbers are only just increasing. So the 2021 re-elections have come at a critical time for all of us in Scotland who want to end the injustice of poverty. And this hustings is an opportunity for all of the main political parties to set out their vision for tackling poverty in this parliamentary session and beyond. So we're delighted to be joined tonight by Shirley-Anne Somerville from the SNP, by Rachael Hamilton from the Scottish Conservatives, Sarwar from Scottish Labour, Alison Johnstone from the Scottish Greens and Willie Rennie from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. We're going to start the event off with Peter Kelly, Director of the Poverty Alliance, giving an overview of the Poverty Alliance manifesto, A Scotland for All of Us. And then each of the panellists will be given 5 minutes to set out their responses. After everyone has spoken, we're then going to move up and we're going to move on to questions from participants, many of which have been submitted in advance. But could I urge you also to use the chat function just to post some questions as we go through the proceedings tonight. We're going to aim to finish promptly at 7 o'clock. And for those of you wishing to tweet, please use the hashtag A Scotland for All of Us. So first up, can I introduce Peter Kelly, Director of the Poverty Alliance. Peter joined the Poverty Alliance in 2002 and then became Director in 2004. He's going to provide an overview of some of the key asks as well as the vision set out in A Scotland for All of Us, the Poverty Alliance's election manifesto. Peter, can I hand over to you, please?
Thanks very much, Fiona. I will try and be brief because I know we want to get on to hear from all of our candidates tonight and hear what they have to say about the challenge of tackling poverty in Scotland. So we come into these elections, though, on the back of a year like no other. A pandemic that has posed a threat to the health of all of us has required a response which at times has mobilised the state, it's mobilised the private sector and crucially communities in ways I think that would have been unimaginable just over a year ago. It's been inspiring to see the commitment that's been displayed to help others and the compassion that's been on display throughout this last year. But I think that mobilisation has also served to highlight some of the weaknesses in our society. It's shown us the fragility of some of our public services, including the inadequacy of aspects of our social security system. It's also shown us the precarious nature of parts of our labour market. We've also seen that as the pandemic has progressed, it's also further entrenched the poverty and inequality that existed before it began. Women and disabled people, people from Black and ethnic minority communities have all been significantly impacted by this pandemic. As we look to the next Parliament and to the recovery from the pandemic, we must take the chance not only to rebuild, but to redesign our economy and our society. The manifesto that we've published contains some proposals that we think will help in that redesign. So let me just highlight just a couple of these. There's a lot of proposals in that manifesto. So we can focus on basic essential services that will help people living on low incomes. That means looking at the extension of free transport for young people, for people who receive low income benefits. It means the further expansion of free childcare. So we're proposing to increase that to 50 hours per week. It could also mean the provision of low-cost broadband. We've seen how important the digital divide has been over the last year in exacerbating some of the aspects of the pandemic. So it means provision of low-cost broadband to people living on low incomes. We also need to continue to develop and set a new course for social security in Scotland. For us, this means practically developing a minimum income guarantee, and we can do this progressively through a number of steps. For instance, by doubling the Scottish Child Payment, increasing the value of support to unpaid carers, and increasing other payments such as Best Start grants and school clothing grants. These are all things that we can do over the next Parliament to progressively realise a commitment to a minimum income guarantee. Our economy and our labour market must also be redesigned. We need to ensure that we spread fair work principles, and we can do this by attaching fair work criteria to all public sector grants, contracts and funding. So there are many things in our manifesto we think are practical steps that we can take to address poverty and inequality. It extends to our economy, to our taxation system, to support for our communities that have been impacted by the pandemic and that were experiencing poverty prior to the pandemic. So I'll finish by saying that the last Scottish Parliament should really be remembered, I think, as one that made a unanimous commitment to tackle child poverty when it passed the Child Poverty Act. The next Parliament must be remembered as one that reshapes Scotland for the better by prioritising the needs of those facing poverty and inequality, and ultimately by taking the actions needed to address that poverty and inequality. I'll leave it there. I'm really looking forward to hearing what all of our candidates have to say tonight, and I look forward to your questions throughout the rest of the evening as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, so first up from the political parties, we're going to hear from Shirley-Anne Somerville from the SNP. Previously Minister for Further and Higher Education, Shirley-Anne is currently Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People. Elected as MSP for Dunfermline in 2016, she is standing again in the same constituency this time round. Shirley-Anne, you've got 5 minutes to set out your response to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everyone. As Peter has said, the impact of COVID has brought into sharp focus the inequalities that are still present in Scotland. And we know they were present before the pandemic, and we know the pandemic has made many of those worse. As has often been said, we were all in the same storm, but we certainly weren't all in the same boat. That's why the First Minister has made clear that she is determined to take bold and decisive action if re-elected to lead Scotland out of the current pandemic and on to recovery. And an important part of that journey will be around tackling poverty, particularly child poverty. Now, the Scottish Child Payment has been described as a game changer by anti-poverty campaigners, and at £10 it was double what was campaigned for at the time. As you'll no doubt already know, it will be extended to children under 16 by the end of 2022. However, we recognise that action is needed now, and we will bring in bridging payments to families with children in receipt of free school meals until that time. And as the First Minister has already announced, we will, of course, over the course of the Parliament, increase the Scottish Child Payment to £20 per week. At primary school, we'll be providing all pupils with free breakfast and lunches all year round, and every school child will also receive a free laptop or device to help end that digital divide. We've already provided free bus travel to over 1 million people across Scotland, and we are, of course, now expanding that to everyone under the age of 22 to make public transport even more accessible. On social security, we will increase the level of and eligibility to Best Start foods and replace the unreliable UK government cold weather payment with a £50 annual payment for low-income households. For unpaid carers, we will deliver another double payment of the carers allowance supplement this year in recognition of their role, but particularly in the past year. And this will be followed by an improved carers assistance payment, which will include additional support for those caring for more than one disabled person, further support for a carer after their loved one has died, and we will look at ways to increase the support given to carers while ensuring that none of that increase is taken away from reserved and passported benefits and tax credits, leaving the carer, of course, no better off. In housing, we've pledged to deliver a further 100,000 affordable homes over the next decade, with 70% of those for social rent. And our vision of housing for 2040 also focuses on the quality and the accessibility of homes, with the new housing standards to cover all homes and new building standards to underpin a Scottish accessible home standard. Of course, we also know that the importance of reducing poverty isn't just through social security or through housing, important though those are, but also through fair work and employment. That's why The SNP have already announced the Young Persons Guarantee, which aims to give everyone aged 16 to 24 the opportunity of work, education or training. The guarantee will provide employers with the resources and the support to support young people into employment. And we have the National Transition Training Fund, targeted at those who have either lost their job or at risk of redundancy as a result of COVID, looking to retrain and develop the skills they need to secure their future employment. Now, as we approach the election and our manifesto is introduced in a few weeks' time, we will of course set out more policies on the areas I've touched on tonight and on many more, including our vision of a minimum guarantee for all. We're very interested in this, and I'm particularly interested given the work of the Social Renewal Advisory Board, which I co-chaired with my colleague Aileen Campbell, which looked at this and many other challenging policies that the government next time should have a look at. And we're determined to do just that, because we do need bold and decisive action to tackle poverty and to lead Scotland on the road to recovery from COVID. And in essence, in conclusion, that is what this election is about. It's the need for experienced leadership where we remain in this pandemic, for the ambitious policies to kickstart recovery and build a fairer society, and of course the right to decide your own future in a referendum, as what we can achieve under devolution is a down payment on what could be possible if only we had the full powers of independence to deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirley-Anne. So next up, we've got Rachael Hamilton from the Scottish Conservatives. Rachael is the Scottish Conservative spokesperson of Social Security, MSP for Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire in the last Scottish Parliament. She was first elected in 2016 and is standing again this time in both that constituency and in the South Scotland regional list. Rachael, can you have your 5 minutes now, please, in response to Peter's manifesto? Thank you. Can you unmute, Rachael? Thank you.
That should be it. Yeah, sorry, Fiona, I didn't realise I had to unmute myself, but thank you anyway for the introduction. And thank you to the Poverty Alliance for inviting me this evening, which is giving me the opportunity to set out how my party will address the relentless injustices that society is facing in Scotland today. We know that the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts that Scotland's economy will not return to pre-pandemic levels until 2024 at the earliest. And so it's important that we recognise that what has so far been done to protect jobs and livelihoods, with the UK government delivering billions to the Scottish budget to support the most vulnerable, and on top of the furlough scheme providing a safety net for 500,000 Scots. But I agree with many of the points that the Poverty Alliance manifesto makes. We know that the societal inequalities exposed by the pandemic have exacerbated, and our focus must be to ensure that the next government elected to Scotland address these inequalities with a strong recovery and support plan. The Scottish Conservatives are yet to publish their manifesto commitments, but see the election as an opportunity to rebuild our economy and our society and put the divisions of the past to bed. The future is daunting, as we know, for many young people. It's been very difficult, whether they're leaving school or leaving their higher education and going into a world where jobs are few and far between. And in fact, we know that the number of young people claiming unemployment benefits has increased dramatically, and we need to begin to rebuild from the pandemic to support these young people. We know that the Kickstart scheme is already in action, and that's giving vital opportunities for those young people. But in addition, the Scottish Conservatives will introduce a £500 Retrain to Rebuild account, which will enable people who have been disproportionately affected by the impacts of job loss to reskill. And we will also introduce a demand-led apprenticeship scheme for Scotland's young people, with a laser-like focus on supporting women. Furthermore, the Scottish Conservatives have highlighted the need for efforts to be centred on ensuring young people reach positive destinations, and we will provide an education guarantee for those people up to the age of 18, whether it's in an apprenticeship or a training scheme, college place, or staying on at school. In his introduction, Peter mentioned that prior to the pandemic, women, children and young people, people with disabilities, people from Black ethnic minority groups were at greatest risk of living in poverty in Scotland. And to me and my party, tackling the disability employment gap as part of the recovery is absolutely paramount. The statistics show that in Scotland, the difference in employment rates stand at a staggering 35%. And the 96 million Fair Start Scotland scheme is not fit for purpose, with only a fifth of people managing to stay in the job for 13 weeks, whilst 40% of those referred didn't even start the programme. My party want to see a replacement employability scheme that helps people with the greatest need to find employment support, training skills and a good wage. And we will announce that in our manifesto. Again, another subject close to my heart is the lack of affordable, accessible childcare, which is a significant barrier preventing many women being able to access training or education. And we have a plan for parents. We would introduce an extra 195 hours of wraparound childcare for working parents and ensure the 1140 hours of childcare policy has true parent flexibility. And the attainment gap is not narrowed under the current government. Scottish Conservatives will invest in early language support for disadvantaged children, commit to free school lunches and breakfast for every primary school child, and a catch-up programme for children impacted by the lack of face-to-face learning and digital exclusion. We want to see a national tutoring programme implemented. And finally, to our shame, almost a quarter of children in Scotland live in poverty. And according to the JRF, the Scottish Government will miss their child poverty targets. But it is a cross-party commitment to providing the Scottish Child Payment, and we will commit to delivering the biggest social house building programme since devolution. And through our Communities Bill, we will also make it an obligation for councils to deliver services for new housing so that we are really building communities alongside these new homes. In conclusion, we need bold, radical action to build a Scotland that supports those in financial crisis and lifts people out of a cycle of poverty for good, tackling root causes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We're going to go over to Anis Sarwar now. Anis has been Scottish Labour leader since February 2021. First elected as an MP in 2010, he was subsequently elected as an MSP in 2016 for Glasgow. In this election, he's standing both on the Glasgow regional list and in Glasgow South Side. Anis, can I hand over to you for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you also to Peter for the kind introduction and also for the opening comments and statements. And can I say, your strapline for today actually should be a mantra that we all live by for the next Parliament, is Scotland for all of us. And I think there's some lessons for us in that strapline. It's very similar to a fight for all of us, which is a strapline that I use around campaigns to challenge prejudice and hate in all its forms across our society. Look, I think we've got to be really honest, and I hope we can have an open and frank conversation this evening. This isn't an ordinary election, and I don't think we should treat this as an ordinary election. This is a pandemic election when 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives. 360,000 of our fellow citizens are currently stuck on furlough, not knowing if and when they'll have a job to go back to. All the deep inequalities we had in our society have been further exposed by this pandemic, have been exacerbated by this pandemic. 1 in 4 children living in poverty across our country, that figure is expected to rise exponentially coming through this pandemic. And I think coming through that, I think our country has a choice. We can either go back to the old ways of doing things, whether that's the old ways of doing things around our economic model, or the old ways of doing things around how we deliver our public services, or even the old ways of doing things about how we treat our Parliament and how we conduct our politics. Or we can choose something different. And I want us to choose something different. I want all of us on this panel today and across the Parliament and across our country to focus on what unites us, not what divides us, so that together we can build a fairer and stronger nation coming through COVID. That should be our collective national mission, focusing on a national recovery plan, recognizing this crisis doesn't end the day the lockdown ends or the day the virus disappears. This is a crisis that we are in for the long haul, and the decisions we make now and the actions we take over the next 5 years will define a generation. And I don't want a lost generation coming through this pandemic. And therefore, Peter, just going through in turn, I'll respond to each of your own policy asks at the outset. I think you've touched upon a real broad range of issues that we and I can wholeheartedly get in behind. The need for free transport, I think, is crucial. How we have greater connectivity across our country both means opening up our economy, but it also means getting confidence back, getting young people interacting with each other again, but also helping us challenge our climate change objectives too. On free childcare, if we are going to have an economy that works for everyone, if we are going to break those disproportionate impacts, particularly on women in our economy, then how we proactively invest in our childcare is going to be a huge part of that. And I wholeheartedly share your ambition on that too. The digital divide, partly is low-cost broadband, partly is access to devices. The truth is we had a digital divide going into the pandemic that has been exposed through the pandemic. And we should have been rolling out devices at the start, not promising them at the start of an election. So I think we've got to really ramp up the access to low-cost broadband and digital devices for people right across. And that's partly those families on low incomes, particularly those children living in poverty, but it's actually also for our older citizens who have been disconnected from wider society. And we need to make sure they feel connected to wider society as well. I wholeheartedly agree with the principle around a minimum income guarantee. My own party will be setting out some more detailed proposals on that in the coming days. And part of that is the doubling of the child payment. I think it's really welcome that we do have the child payment. I want us to go further, though. I don't want us to have a commitment to double the Scottish child payment by the end of the next Parliament. I want us to immediately double the Scottish child payment because we have a poverty crisis in the here and now that we have to address now, not wait 5 years to address that child poverty crisis. Alongside that, the carers allowance, alongside that, the Best Start grants. We'll be saying more in the coming days also about rolling out of breakfast clubs and free school meals, which I think is really important. Housing, obviously a massive part of it. There is a clear connection between the quality of housing, the safety of your housing, the level of rent you're paying in your housing, your energy bills. All of these a huge impact on your level of poverty and the level of disposable income you have as a household. All of these things I think have to be addressed. So that is, yes, building new homes. Yes, it's retrofitting homes. It's also making we have much greater regulation of fair rents across the country too, and much greater responsibilities on those private sector landlords in terms of their responsibilities to their tenants. These are all things that I think we have to much more robustly look into. But the main part for me in terms of our national recovery plan has to be around jobs, because there is such a connection between the access to the labour market, the kind of job that you do, the level of pay that you receive, and that having a direct impact then on the level of life you can live and what you can do for your children and for your wider families. And that's why I want us to have the most boldest and most ambitious economic plan going into this election in the history of devolution. And I've set out my own party's proposals on that today. That's partly a youth jobs guarantee, because we can't come through this and leave a generation on the scrap heap like we've seen from previous economic downturns. So I want us to have a youth jobs guarantee. It's also about expanding apprenticeships. So I want 5,000 new apprenticeships across the country, but not at the low paid £4.62, whatever it is, apprentice rate, which I think is completely unacceptable. We need to have a much greater ambition so we can encourage people to uptake apprenticeships and have more apprenticeships across the country. But we've also got to look beyond just the young unemployed. There are long-term unemployed who require additional support. That's why I want us to have a drawdown account where people can get access to new skills and training. And for those long-term unemployed also who aren't on furlough, so don't have that added income, we should be doing some level of paid training up to around £750 a year. So it's circa 80 hours based on the living wage rate. So people are paid, incentivized to go on that training and then able to access the labour market. I think that's really important. And even for those on furlough, we've got to give that new added training to those people on furlough. So if they do have the unfortunate situation where the sector they are in is decimated or they do lose their job, they're using the time they have on furlough to learn that new skill and to go back into work. I think that's the kind of ambition that we need across the country, because there is a clear connection between work and poverty. I see Fiona's looking at me for time, so I'm going to stop right there. My final sentence, Fiona, on this is, this has to be our collective national mission. It has to be. We have to have a parliament that's collective obsession is ending poverty in our country and creating opportunity. And I will work with any political party to achieve that, because that has to be our collective national focus.
Thanks very much, Janice. Thank you. Okay, next up we've got Alison Johnstone from the Scottish Greens. Alison is co-leader of the Greens in Scottish Parliament. First elected as an MSP for Lothian in 2011, she's standing again for Lothian on 6th of May. And I think a special thanks is due to Alison, who's here despite having broken bones in her arm, only sustained just recently. So we're delighted that you've still managed to make it. So over to you for 5 minutes, Alison. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I wouldn't miss it for the world. It's a very welcome and important distraction, Fiona. I'm really pleased to be here this evening. The Scottish Greens, we will set out in our manifesto our bold and ambitious plans for a fair and green recovery from COVID. I think it's fair to say we've already been playing our part in that with our budget negotiations with the Scottish Government, where we secured free bus transport for all aged 21 and under and an expansion of free school meals, because I think a huge part of addressing poverty in Scotland, which absolutely should be our national mission, is making everyday life affordable for as many people as possible. So these measures are tremendously important. We have specific measures that will be outlined as our manifesto is unrolled in the next couple of weeks, but we would like to accelerate the rollout of the new Scottish Child Payment, and I'm pleased at the fact that other parties too have committed to double that payment, but we need to do that as quickly as possible. We'd like to see increased Best Start grants, and the school clothing grant, we'd like to see that increase by £100. This could be worth an extra £400 to some of our poorest families. We would like to ensure that all devolved payments increase annually, at least in line with rising costs. And we believe that payments aimed at children should be double locked to rise annually with the higher of inflation or rises in average incomes. We want to scrap the benefit cap, which costs some of our poorest families up to £2,200 per year, by providing local authorities with sufficient funds to provide grants to fully mitigate it, as we do with the bedroom tax. We too want warm and green homes for all. That manifesto will unveil plans about the tens of thousands of houses we want to build. The fact that we want them all to be warmed homes. We'll also be introducing a green infrastructure plan, which is, will contain a great deal of detail of the jobs that we want to see in the new economy, because we're not only coming out of a pandemic, we are in the midst of climate and nature emergencies, but we believe that we can tackle them, and in doing so, we can provide high quality, meaningful jobs. We absolutely have to make sure that everyone is paid a real living wage as a basic minimum. We want to end the two-child limit and the rape clause. I mean, the two-child limit fundamentally distorts our social security system because it breaks the link with need. It suggests, well, you may be in need, but, so what? Because we've put on this arbitrary limit. I mean, that's simply, well, it's inhumane, it's discriminatory, it's wholly wrong. And we will request the UK government end the two-child limit in Scotland, and we will ensure that the cost of funding that is met by any future Scottish government. We want to double the Young Carer Grant to £600 a year. The Young Carer Grant was in our last manifesto. I'm delighted the Scottish Government picked up on that swiftly, but we'd like to see that doubled, and that's through discussions with the young carers groups. And we'd like to increase the carers allowance to at least £105 per week. We really need to tackle child poverty for good. When we're speaking about some 230,000 children in this relatively affluent, well, let's face it, affluent country, it is wholly unacceptable, and we can't hope to close any attainment gap while we have such shocking rates of child poverty. We need an adequate income for all. Everyone has the right to an adequate income to live on, regardless of their individual circumstances. And I wholeheartedly support the Poverty Alliance manifesto, and in particular, the discussion of a minimum income. No one should be asked to live on an income that's simply not possible to live on. I mean, since our foundation 30 years ago, the Scottish Greens have been strong advocates for a basic income. And I welcome the fact that the pandemic has broadened that discussion, and other parties, I think, have begun to realise that this would be very, very worth exploring. I mean, we would like to do more than explore it, and we'd like to negotiate with the UK government to see how it'd be possible to introduce meaningful pilots within the UK, and I'll maybe have a chance to explore that later. I think it's absolutely clear that we need to take a different path to the one that we were on before the pandemic, where too many people were in insecure housing or low-paid, precarious jobs. I mean, they have suffered terribly throughout, and they're the people we've all relied on to get us through this pandemic. The delivery drivers, the people working in, takeaway and poorly paid hospitality jobs. But people they've lost loved ones, they've lost livelihoods. We have shown too, though, what we can do when we're forced to. We're suddenly able to make sure that everyone has a roof over their heads. Well, it shouldn't take a pandemic to achieve that. And if we're serious about changing the future, and I think it's one that we do need to change, there's a lot of work that we can do starting here and now. And, I don't think, there probably isn't a more important hustings to be at, quite frankly, than one where we get down to serious discussions about how we're going to make sure that poverty in Scotland is a sign to the past. And thank you, Fiona. I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Alison. So finally, I'd like to hand over to Willie Rennie from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Willie is leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats and has been since 2011. He's been MSP for North East Fife since 2016 and was previously MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife from 2011 to 2016. Willie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. I want to start by complimenting Peter Kelly and the Poverty Alliance. Peter and I have known each other for a number of years now, and he's always polite and respectful. I have to say, he never holds back when it comes to making the case on poverty when he visits us in Parliament, and I think you're lucky to have him. And I think the manifesto that he was outlining earlier on gives you a clear indication as to how effective he is. You may recall a few years ago there was an 8-year-old boy in Glasgow. A teacher noticed that he was pocketing tomato sauce sachets in the canteen, and he was taking them home, squeezing the ketchup out and adding them to boiling water to make soup. It's all he had to eat. The boy was starving, but thankfully he was spotted, there was an intervention, and there was a referral to a food bank. It depresses me that he was ever in that position. But it actually gives me hope that the society and the system caught him before it was really too late. There are countless reasons as to why families can find themselves in those positions. The delays built into universal credit, for one, insecure work that we all know about, we all experience, we meet people in those conditions, and no recourse to public funds. And all these issues I'm sure we'll explore as the evening progresses. The boy's parents were struggling with mental health. The links between mental health and poverty is just one of the reasons transforming mental health services is really important to me. It's why we must cut the waits for treatment. Education is also part of the solution as well. We've got a plan for bounce back support for education. Children have lost out an awful lot in the last year. But there was a yawning poverty-related attainment gap before that. So we need to invest in early learning and childcare. The best investment I think we can make in education is in the early years, the very early years, which is why we were particularly supportive of increasing the childcare offer to 2-year-olds from disadvantaged backgrounds. And we were in support of extending the pupil equity fund, something we've been arguing for years, getting targeted support in schools, again, for those in disadvantaged backgrounds, and more in-class support to help every child reach their potential, especially those who've lost out in the last year. So education, I think, is at the foundation of how we can secure a recovery, but how we can close the poverty gap as well. And work is another part of it. We need to have a job guarantee for every young person, so we don't have a generation scarred by unemployment again. New jobs in clean tech and green energy to future-proof the careers, and new retraining support for people who need it. On housing, over 5 years, we want to build 60,000 affordable homes, 40,000 of those for social rent. Everyone deserves an opportunity to work hard, to build a life for themselves and their family and their community. Everyone deserves to be paid a fair wage, and too many just aren't paid a fair wage. They work hard, incredibly hard hours, and they don't get the money just even to be able to afford their property. So we need to change that. And that was the reality before the pandemic. So this is not just about the pandemic and the impact on it. We were in a very poor position before we even started. Our government, both governments, worked really hard to get money to people quickly when the pandemic hit, but there was about 3 million who were just excluded from any kind of support, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to try and pilot the universal basic income model last year. We were trying to persuade both governments to do it. It would have been an ideal situation when we were using so much money to support people that we should have been using a universal basic income model at that point to test it out in real life, not just the pilots, but test it out in real life. And I think that could have been a great advantage. The Smith Commission secured £3 billion of welfare and social security funding for Scotland for the first time, a big budget. But 6 years on, we're only spending a fraction of that in Scotland. We handed many of those powers back to the DWP. We do need to get on with this. I know it's hard developing these new systems, but the longer that we leave it, the more difficult that it gets. I support an enhanced carers allowance and a UK-wide uplift of £1,000 a year. However, I want to close on a note of consensus. I will agree with the other panelists that we need to double the child payment and extend it further. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation is clear that without this, the government is at risk of missing the 2024 child poverty target. This is the target that the whole of the Scottish Parliament agreed unanimously, and it would be all of our shame on the Parliament and ourselves and our government if we missed that target. We agreed it together, we need to deliver it together. And if we do combine our efforts, combine our skills and the talents of the people in this country to secure a fair recovery, so we leave our country in a better condition than we started, I think that will be a good legacy for this generation. It's why I think we need to put recovery first. Thank you, Fiona.
Okay, thanks a lot, Willie. And thanks again to all the other panellists for your inputs. We're going to move straight to questions now, and those are questions that have been set by participants. I'm kind of conscious of time, we've got loads of questions tonight, so I'm going to ask the panellists if you could be quite brief and concise in your responses. And what we'll do is we'll go in reverse order this time. So I'm going to put the first question to Willie first. And the first question is, people from Black and minority ethnic groups face a higher risk of experiencing poverty. Does the panel agree that structural racism is the driving factor behind this? And what action will they commit to taking in the next Scottish Parliament to tackle poverty among Black and minority ethnic groups? So Willie, can I ask you to respond to that question first?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, who knows whether there's structural racism in our society? I tend to think that there is. I tend to think that there is there's a complacency in Scotland about how we address the whole issue of race. We think we handle these things better. And I actually think fundamentally we've still got a problem. And I think that is felt by ethnic minority communities. And that's why we need to address it very seriously. I think the tools we use are actually the same tools, but we need to have a laser-like focus on those communities to make sure they're getting the support, that we're breaking through. And we need to make sure we've got representatives from all of those communities leading the efforts to make sure that they get access to the training support, the education support, the early learning and childcare support, the mental health support that is critical. All of those things, I believe, are essential to making sure that we are truly an equal society, because I think just now we're not really cracking it.
Okay, thanks, Willie. Alison, can I go to you next to respond to the same question?
Yes, absolutely. There is structural racism in our society. The evidence exists to prove it, regardless of what the incredible report that was just published may have concluded. I think we could go some way to addressing this if we have to make sure this issue is constantly visible. We have to talk about it more. We have to acknowledge and accept that we've all got a part to play in addressing it. It's no surprise that people from Black and minority ethnic communities suffered, more badly from COVID. They are disadvantaged in so many other ways that their health is impacted. They are more likely to live in overcrowded conditions. They're more likely to have had interventions with the justice system. The list goes on and on. I'd like to see us having far more representation from those communities in our local authorities and in our parliamentary chamber. We have a very poor record when it comes to that. And then we'd have, better understanding of hearing those voices. And we've got a part to play, of course, as political parties to bring that change about within our own structures. There's a lot to do, but I do think recognising it, acknowledging it and committing would be a very helpful beginning.
Okay, thank you. And Anis, over to you. How do we address structural racism and tackle poverty experienced by Black and minority ethnic groups?
Thank you, Fiona. There is, of course, structural racism, just like there's structural sexism. And unless we recognise it and confront it, we're not going to see the action we need to see. And it's all very easy for politicians of every political party. This is not targeted at any one political party. It's very easy for all political parties to get in behind campaigns when the hashtags are trending. But actually, when the hashtags aren't trending, you have to do the difficult stuff. It's actions that matter, not words. And how do we challenge it head on? We've got to challenge it in an employment market. There are disproportionate structural issues in an employment market. A BBC investigation found you are 4 times less likely to get called for an interview if you put in the exact same CV if your first name was Mohammed compared to if your first name was Adam. Now, my son's called Adam, that's just a coincidence. But there is structural inequalities when it comes to the employment market. Structural inequalities when it comes to our education system. We deliberately teach a very whitewashed history of our country. Why? We should be treating the true history of our country. So there are structural issues around our education system. There are structural issues in terms of intersectionality, meaning, more often than not, the victims of hate are women, and more often than not, the perpetrators of that hate are men. That's not a coincidence. There are some intersectional issues around that too. The media has a part to play, and I don't just mean broadcast media, I'm talking about print media. Social media has got a part to play in that, where you see particular communities targeted or attempted to silence or minimized or othered. That needs to be confronted head on too. And then the final part is around poverty. I think you've seen it during this pandemic. Disproportionately more people from a BME background lost their lives. Disproportionately more people from a BME background worked in our NHS. Disproportionately more people from a BME background worked on the front line, whether it was retail, food production, food delivery. So there are deep inequalities within our structural makeup of our economy. And unless we target them and confront them head on, they're going to continue to get worse. So it is of utmost importance to me. Part of it is representation, of course it is, but representation in itself is not enough. What the decisions you make and the change you make is ultimately what is going to change people's lives.
Okay, thank you, Anis. And Rachael, over to you. Same question of structural racism and what actions we can commit to address poverty amongst Black and minority ethnic groups.
Yeah, I mean, Anna's put that very well, I have to say. We have a diversity commission run by Baroness Nashina Nabarak, and that has been incredibly rich with ensuring that we have representation, particularly in the Parliament. And I agree with Anis on that particular point that we cannot just rely on the fact that we are looking to have a diverse representation in the Scottish Parliament. It would be a start, I have to say. And we've got some fantastic Black and Asian minority ethnic candidates coming forward, and we're very proud of that in this Holyrood election. And so that in itself will help in terms of looking at the issues that are facing BAME population, particularly the disproportionate number of COVID deaths, and the fact that, as Anna said, that they have been working in retail and hospitality and the sectors that have been shut down. And I mean, it is probably the case that individuals are also more impacted in terms of having job loss. And it's because of those reasons that we must ensure that we put in place good employability schemes. And that's why in my opening remarks that I talked about particularly those individuals who, are so far away from the workplace that we need to have good schemes that actually work rather than schemes that are set up that actually don't perform and don't represent individuals who are far from the employment ladder. The other points that I probably want to make are in terms of health inequalities with regards to BAME people. Matt Hancock commissioned a report which was incredibly interesting, ensuring that we have consideration made to BAME people in our health decisions. I think that's important, as well as also the vaccination situation, where perhaps we need to ensure that when we're looking at things like vaccine passports, which we haven't so far committed to, there are pilot studies, of course, out there, but it's how will people who are facing inequalities right now, how will they cope if they haven't had a vaccine because they have chosen not to have a vaccine, whether you believe in that or not, but then they are taken away from actually engaging with a job or society or an event, wherever it might be. These are all the ethical and moral questions that we need to be looking at as we rebuild our economy and go forward. And, absolutely every single one of these BAME people need to be part of the answer to our economic recovery, but our societal recovery as well.
Thanks, Rachel. And finally, Shirley-Anne Somerville, could we have your response to that question, please?
Thanks very much. Well, I would absolutely agree with many of the speakers who have said that structural racism exists, and it's important that we just accept that, because if we don't accept that, we're never going to tackle the problem if we're still debating whether it exists or not in the first place. One of in fact, the very last ministerial appointment that I had before Purda was actually on public sector leadership in employment for Black minority ethnic community, because we recognise that there's more that the public sector needed to do, there's more the Scottish Government needed to do, and across all our public agencies. And the challenge was very much put there right up in front to the whole of the public sector, that we need to do more because we have a problem and we need to tackle that. When it comes to looking at jobs and employment, I think one of the absolute key to how we come out of the pandemic is to ensure that what we're putting in place in terms of recovery works for everyone. And that might be people that are furthest away from the labour market, or definitely the people that have been hit hardest by COVID. And of course, Black minority ethnic community have absolutely been hit hardest by COVID. So we have to ensure that what we're putting in place in terms of training packages, economic recovery packages, has that front and centre within what it's determined to do. And education, as some folk have mentioned, is absolutely critical to this. We need to ensure that we're developing a generation of young people who are tolerant, who recognise their role, all our roles in delivering the type of Scotland that I think we all want to see, but we're not there yet. And that does, of course, include a review of the curriculum and encouraging more Black minority ethnic teachers to come forward. So as well as our Parliament representing the Scotland that we are, our schools and our public sector need to represent that as well. On social security, there's also an absolute determination that, again, we need to ensure that the benefit take-up is across the board, and it's not just to the people who will be the easiest to target. And that's something we've absolutely been determined to do in social security, to enhance the take-up of benefits all the way through. But I know this is something, in general, this issue is something that we will see much more on in our manifesto, but unfortunately not that I can announce tonight.
Okay, right, thanks Shirley-Anne. Okay, so the second question, and I'm going to start kind of somewhere in the middle this time, is about community empowerment. So throughout lockdown, communities demonstrated they are well placed to identify effective solutions to poverty. What are the panellists' plans to truly empower communities to continue this work? Can I start this time with you, Anis Sarwar?
Thanks, Fiona. Absolutely. I can't re-emphasise that enough. I mean, the way that local communities went above and beyond to look out for their neighbours, to support their neighbours, was absolutely phenomenal and incredible. So whilst we think about the negatives of the pandemic, naturally, and how it separated us from our loved ones and our families, we actually came together as communities and as a country like never before. And I want us to keep that spirit of community going forward. To be honest, it all depends on budgets. I mean, we can all talk a good game, but unless we properly resource local government, local community organisations, and empower local people, we're not going to fulfil the ambitions we have to have that community spirit. And when I talk about recovery, I talk about a recovery that works for everyone. And I don't just mean works for everyone based on their demographics in terms of their identity. It's also going to be a recovery that works for north, south, east, west, urban, rural, coastal, island communities as well. So what I want to see happen is power pushed out from our parliament into local communities, empower local communities. That's partly properly funding local government. It's partly properly funding local organisations. It's partly creating local opportunities for people to create jobs in the voluntary sector as well as the private and the public sector too. But it's also about having regional hubs where we actually push economic levers out from the parliament into the local communities and regions across the country, so that those local people are empowered along their local elected representatives. Because to be honest, a parliamentarian sitting in Glasgow or from Glasgow, sitting in Parliament in Edinburgh, isn't going to automatically understand the needs of our island communities or understand the needs of the south of Scotland, for example. So let's push out power and resource so those local communities can make judgment calls about what sectors they want to invest in, what kind of organisations they want to invest in, what skills they want local, so people can stay local, work local, be active local, build successful local public services, grow, bring their children up local, retire local at the same time. That's the kind of recovery for all I think we need to see.
Okay, thanks, Hannes. We're going to go to Alison Johnstone next. Again, on the question of community empowerment, what are the Scottish Greens' plans to truly empower local communities to continue to make the kinds of contribution they did during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, really great question. I've thought about this long and hard. I mean, the Scottish Greens have a commitment to subsidiarity and to government at the level that's closest to the people. It's one of the reasons we support Scottish independence, and we're not interested in an independent Scotland or that looks like Westminster. A mini Westminster at Holyrood that's no use. We want to be far more ambitious and bold and radical, and there are rightly concerns about the centralising that goes on, certainly in some aspects of the current government's programme. I mean, imagine if you went to your local community council, and I know I was a councillor in Edinburgh before I was elected to Parliament, and I'd sit there some evenings and the community councillors would say, oh, I don't understand why we're not getting more young people along, and I don't understand why we're not attracting, a more varied demographic or a more representative group. And sometimes that's to do with people's commitments at that time in the evening. This is something that puts a lot of people out of politics. We're losing some fabulous women MSPs this session. I'd put forwards as a result of that inflexibility. But imagine if community councils were given a reasonable amount of cash. Imagine if every community council, for a start off, let's say, was given £500,000. I think you'd have people wanting to get involved, because at the end of the day, the power is where the money is, isn't it? So if you truly empowered from the grassroots up, you'd see a change. Our local authorities in Scotland are some of the weakest in Europe, and our so-called local representation isn't local at all. There are countries in the EU where I think 1 in 80 people stand for local government. I mean, in Scotland, if you stand for local government, you're still seen as something of an outlier, and it's quite unusual. It shouldn't be unusual. So I think, real grassroots change starts from, we should start learning about it in school, and we do have more pupil councils. We should then go on and become a member of a community council that has a meaningful budget. We could then perhaps, I'm not suggesting this is all about progress, because local government does a lot of important work. I'm not suggesting that the Parliament is more important than local government, but some have far more access to cash and far more access to power than others. And I would like to see that dispersed. I mean, we've got to be serious about that, or we're not going to see the change that we want. And local government will continue to rely on handouts and council tax freezes. And we know, there's a very contentious issue. I mean, our manifesto certainly has a commitment to a fairer, more progressive taxation system. Actually, there's a fair amount going to be put.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure taxation is probably a whole other question in itself, but thanks for that, Alison. The same question posed to Rachael Hamilton then. Community empowerment, what actions will you take to properly empower communities?
Thanks, Fiona. Well, the first thing is I want to thank our local resilience hubs for being so fantastic during the pandemic. two things that they did was to fend off social isolation by setting up a really amazing network, which just shows the power of devolving the things that matter to people and getting support out to people very quickly and efficiently. And of course, the other thing that they did was, get food to shielding people when there was such confusion with the Scottish Government supporting shielding people and getting missing out so many people on the list initially. And the second point I want to make, which we have a Scottish Conservative administration in the borders, and what they did was when we realised that schools were going to be shut and the laptops had to get out to the children with the lack of face-to-face learning, that programme had already been implemented, unlike it had across the whole of Scotland, where there was a patchy delivery of laptops and digital devices, and indeed access to 4G and broadband, which was topped up by our local authority, which I thought was fantastic because it allowed at least one digital device to be in a family home, whereas in the last few weeks we've seen that some young people haven't even had access to that. So this is an incredibly important question to be asking, and I think that it can be the defining way to actually deliver locally and tackle issues on transport and connectivity. Here in the Scottish borders, we have a huge geographical area, and the local people want to deliver integrated public transport. Now, if that's what the local people want, we should be able to ensure that the funding is correct from the Scottish Government down to the devolved level of the local authorities, where the people know best and the communities know best what they need, from housing to transport to education. So the Scottish Conservatives, you ask about what we would do in terms of our policy, we would enshrine in law a fair funding for local authorities, which would deliver all these vital public services. And we just think it's fair that as the Scottish budget increases, so does the local authority budget increase. We know that the current council capital budget has been slashed, and with a focus on rebuilding our communities from the pandemic, we have to absolutely fund our local services fairly. The other point that I'd like to make, that it's going to be so important to look at some sort of procurement programme. We're looking at we've committed to a policy which sets in line a procurement, a Scotland procurement first policy, and that would allow local authorities, some do it already, particularly in Ayrshire, but to look at ensuring that any purchases that are made are bought locally and local businesses are supported, rather than the money being spent out of an area and not supporting jobs in the economy and supporting vulnerable people.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I need to give time for all of you to respond to the same question. So I'm going to go to you, Willie, next for the question on community empowerment, then followed by Shirley-Anne, and then we'll kind of speed it up a bit because we've still got a good few questions to get through tonight. So Willie, can I give you the chance to respond to the question on community empowerment, please?
When you ask politicians to be brief, we never are. We'll try to speed it up a wee bit. I mean, this is multifaceted because there's involvement, engagement in council decisions and government decisions, and we want more people to be engaged in that. So community budgeting and so on is really important. But then I think there's individual actions of voluntary kind of kindness, generosity to neighbours, communities and so on. And that's definitely improved through the pandemic. But often it does in a crisis. And the real challenge for us, I think, is to be able to capture that engagement. Sometimes for people for the first time ever, they've got involved in these local COVID groups. How do we make sure we continue to keep them involved and get them to become those expert volunteers that then contribute to the wider well-being of the community? Now, part of that is about funding, because councils are so up against it. They don't have the flexibility to be able to say, right, there's a good local community group that needs a little bit extra money to do the things that it wants to do. So we need to be able to have councils with the flexibility to be able to identify good local talent that is going to do good local things. And that just isn't there just now. So you lose the interest and the enthusiasm of these people that have certainly come forward through the pandemic if we don't actually support them in what they need. Too often, government and councils do things to people rather than with people. And that needs to be turned on its head. We need to be led by these community groups and the good quality people that come forward to do things, to lead, because those are the leaders of the future in our communities. And just sometimes we just suffocate them out when they go off and do other things. So let's seize this moment from the pandemic with people coming forward to give them the power, give them the funds, make sure that we pull them into the system to get them more involved so we can get a vibrant local democracy and voluntary action combined. I think that's the way to do it. But we've got a short window to do this. And I think people who have joined this event tonight are part of the solution to this, of identifying good people and keeping them involved. Because if we lose them, we won't get them back.
Okay, thanks, Willie. So finally, Shirley-Anne Somerville, can I come to you for that last question, community empowerment, please, and the plans that you'll take to truly empower local communities?
Thanks very much. One of the areas of work which we had to pause in the Scottish Government because of COVID was the local governance review. And I think that was really disappointing because that had the potential to come up with some really bold and radical proposals about how we can change where power lies, how power is used in Scotland. But actually, on reflection, I don't think in the end it was a bad thing for that to have been delayed, because I think there are absolutely lessons that we can and should learn from the experience that we've all had during COVID that demonstrates the power of local communities and the ways that local communities can work together in perhaps ways that we couldn't have possibly have imagined if we had sat there looking at it theoretically before COVID had arisen. And I think, Willie's right, we've got to have a look and challenge ourselves, and not just at national government, but at local government level, at any organisation that holds power, to challenge ourselves about how we come back from COVID and whether that's in the same way that we go back to the same ways of working. And community empowerment, I think, is one of those examples of how we can come back in a very different way. So while the work on the local governance review, as I say, was paused, we have great potential to use that extra time that we now have to reflect on a far better way of doing things. And if we don't, I think that will be, again, one of the missed opportunities as we move out of COVID. One of the other aspects I think is critical to this, and again, it's regardless of what layer of government we're on, is ensuring that we have people with lived experience in the policy-making process. So while we have community empowerment, we should also challenge ourselves to make sure that we're not making policies for people, but we're making policies with people. Now, we've got areas of the Scottish Government that have done that well. I think social security is an obvious example of that, but we need to do better at a national level on that. And I think there is room for all of us to learn at all levels of government about how that can be done better. Again, there are fantastic examples about how this can be done within local government too. So I think if you put the two aspects together around community empowerment and the ability to use lived experience in our policy making, you could really see something coming out of this horrible, horrible year that will ensure that Scotland uses the potential of its people in a much better way than we have done in the past.
Okay, thanks, Shirley-Anne. Now we've got about just over 15 minutes left, and we've still got quite a few questions to go through, as I say. So I'm going to go into another round of questions. And again, just to repeat, if you wouldn't mind just kind of like maybe just taking 1 minute max so that we can get through some of the questions that we've had. It's difficult because these are big questions. So the third question that I've got from the participants is, disabled people face huge barriers to employment and as a result are much more likely to be living in poverty. What more do the panel think can be done to increase the number of disabled people in employment? For example, would you support tax incentives for employers to take on people with disabilities or government job guarantees so that people with disabilities don't end up long-term unemployed? Now, this time I'm going to pose that question first to Rachael. Rachael Hamilton, could you come back on that question about disabled people and employment?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I'll be quick as I can. I am absolutely passionate about this issue. And in my opening statement, I mentioned that we have an employment disability gap of 35.5%. I mean, it is not acceptable that those people who are non-disabled people have much better employment chances than those who are disabled. And I think it just speaks volumes of where we are with the Fair Start Scotland scheme. It was a scheme that's cost £96 million. My party, in their manifesto, will hopefully make an announcement that sets out a new type of employability scheme that would allow disabled people to have a much fairer opportunity to be able to take on a job or skill up for a job and stay in a job and have that job that was a sustainable job, that an individual wasn't supported enough that they dropped out of that scheme. I think it's really important that we look at this, not only for the well-being of our society, but also to help in terms of our rebuilding back with our economy. And I'll stop there because I know you want me to be brief. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Rachel. Thank you. So I'm going to pose that question next to Willie. Willie, what the Scottish Liberal Democrats going to do? What are your plans to make sure that more disabled people get into employment? Willie, can you unmute?
Yeah, sorry. We need to use all the financial tools that we've got available to us. So the combination of wage subsidies, tax incentives, but also making sure that we have the guarantee side of it too. So the job guarantee is an important element. But we also need to get, there is, what is it called? Is it CES, the Organisation of Supported Employment Employers? That organisation needs to be given greater funding to be able to spread the best practice across all the employers. There are some great examples of companies that have taken on disabled people, and we need to be doing more of that to make sure that it's spread out. I think the final aspect of it is to make sure that when we've got the business standard that we create in society, I think needs to incentivize businesses to do more of this, because it can't be seen to be a burden on those businesses. It needs to be seen as an asset, and currently that's not the case with all employers. So we would want to use all the tools that's available to us to make sure that this is spread right across society.
Okay, thanks, Willie. Shirley-Anne Somerville, can I come to you on that? SNP plans to get more disabled people into employment.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I'm sure it was just due to lack of time that Rachael didn't mention whether or not this new policy she had is going to have sanctions in it for disabled people who don't take part. I certainly hope it doesn't, unlike the DWP plans, because I think that would be exceptionally detrimental to disabled people everywhere and not help encourage people into employment. The whole issue is something which is a concern. I mean, this again predates COVID, but it's been accentuated by COVID. We'll have seen some steady progress in the employment gap for disabled people pre-COVID. We were seeing that progress, but it isn't going as quickly as we would like, particularly given the impact of COVID. And that's why I'll just give one example, just because I'm conscious of time. The No One Left Behind policy that we have when we're looking at delivering employment support is exceptionally important. So that's to ensure that everybody has the ability to be able to get into the labour market, get the support and get the assistance that they require in a way where they feel genuinely supported and encouraged to get into the labour market. So I'll leave it there, given I'm only to do 1 minute.
Right, thanks, Shirley-Anne. Alison, over to you for your response to the question of disabled people into employment.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there's a disability employment gap there, it's like the gender pay gap, it just clearly demonstrates discrimination. And if we want to eradicate discrimination in society, we've got to act. And we can do that through procurement policies, we can do it by incentivising the employment of disabled people, and we can do it with legislation that simply prohibits that discrimination, because we also need a culture change. So I think we do need to be discussing this more fully. I think that disability employment gap isn't spoken of as frequently as other gaps in society. I'd like to see the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disability incorporated into Scots law, so that we are compelled to take heed of the rights of disabled people. And just, when you just think about it, look at the talent and that we're wasting and the opportunities we're denying to people to have a more complete rounded life. I very much look forward to this discussion as we go on this session of Parliament, because we've got to do something about this.
Thanks, Alison.
More about it.
Okay. Thanks, Alison. Finally, over to you, Annis, for your response to that question.
Thanks, Fiona. I said right at the start that we'd published today the most ambitious and biggest job creation plan in the history of the Scottish Parliament, and there are some detailed proposals about what we do, particularly for people with a disability. It's partly around access to the George Guarantee Scheme. It's obviously access to the Skills Drawdown Fund. It's access to the paid training fund, but also within that, we want to create a national programme to support individuals who are already disadvantaged within the labour market. That means specific and targeted career support, training and placements. And we also want to extend the Job Start grant to all young disabled people and double the grant to £500 for young disabled and care leavers as well. We've got to match the rhetoric with action. And if we recognise the huge challenge we face coming through this pandemic, we've got to put cash behind it and put the budgets behind it to make it happen.
Okay, thanks, Annis. Right, we want to cram 2 more questions in, if that's at all possible. So we've got a final one on equalities, and that question is: women have been disproportionately affected by the economic impact of COVID-19. What will the parties do to ensure that our recovery tackles women's poverty and gender inequality more broadly? And Willie, can I come to you first on that question, please? And again, if we could make it quick this time, that would be great, so that we can cram another one in before the end.
So I think we need to make significant improvements in I know it's not just the responsibility of women, certainly, but we need to improve the childcare offer. Early learning and childcare needs to improve significantly, and certainly the take-up, particularly for 2-year-olds, which is a very low take-up just now, that needs to improve significantly. We're going to have to address the issue around about the WASPy women and how they've lost out, and we need to make more efforts on a UK level, as well as looking at how the new social security system in Scotland can actually make up some of that issue as well. We're going to have to make sure that the training and retraining opportunities that are available for women as well, to train into new positions and new opportunities. It is true that women have been at the front line in this pandemic, whether it's through social care, where we need a pay increase, a significant one, but we also, in terms of supermarkets and the other sectors that have been at the front line in this pandemic. So we do need to step up, recognise that inequality, and make sure they get the right support.
Thanks, Willie. Over to you then next, Alison Johnstone. How can recovery tackle gender inequality and poverty?
Well, I think the pandemic's clearly had a disproportionate impact on women, and it's set back progress on gender equality. And women are more likely to work in low-paid jobs, so they're more likely to experience greater economic and domestic disruption. And the gender biases in Scotland mean that women often take on more unpaid care work, for example, which has in turn been exacerbated by that need for childcare and schoolwork. So a green recovery must have gender equality at its heart. And in the next Parliament, the Scottish Greens are going to work hard to incorporate in gender and close the gaps, gender and economic recovery principles. You know, those are expert organisations who've put forward proposals that we really need at this point in time, and we must pay heed to those.
Okay, thanks, Alison. So same question to you, Annis. How can recovery support gender equality?
Really important question, because we had deep gender inequalities pre-COVID. They've been exacerbated by COVID. The way we do it is recognising the sectors where women disproportionately work, and that work is disproportionately poorly paid, the social care sector being one part of that. That's why we support a £12 an hour wage for social care workers, rising to £15 an hour going forward. Specific training around skills training and access into certain sectors for women, to give them that additional support, so we can break that sectoral divide that we have far too many sectors. Recognising the importance that childcare in particular has. Far too often the childcare and caring responsibilities more widely falls on to women, so we cannot allow those caring responsibilities to block that access to the labour market. So how we ramp up childcare is going to be really important as we come through this pandemic, and actually investing in those sectors for the future. I think that's we've got to confront the structural inequalities that exist in our society. We have an opportunity, actually. Coming through COVID, we have an opportunity to reshape our economy to the way it works for individuals. And challenging that gender inequality has got to be at the heart of that.
Okay, thanks, Hannes. Same question to you, Rachael Hamilton.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll start off with the inequalities caused by COVID. Of course, many of the participants tonight have said that women have been disproportionately affected because they work in certain sectors that were shut down due to restrictions. So therefore, these women need to be supported with retraining skills and ensuring that they can get into a job that is well paid, and possibly that includes a job that is part of a greener economy. However, women have also been affected by the caring responsibilities, as Alison Johnson has said. So some women have had to give up their jobs because their husband works or their partner works, and they've had to homeschool their child. And I think it's very important that we accelerate the 1140 hours rollout of childcare, and also extend the wraparound childcare by the Scottish Conservatives for the policy of 5 hours per week for P1s to P3s to help women ensure that they can actually get back to work without having them to step back and allow their other half or their partner to be able to go out to work instead. It's really important that we support women in that way. But also, I just want to say in education, I think we should have a STEM teacher in every school so that we can encourage women to get into STEM subjects, because we know that those sorts of jobs in later life are actually paid better. And so it's about getting women into well-paid jobs and ensuring that they have the education, the skills and the training and the care package to be able to do that.
Okay, thanks, Rachael. And finally, Shirley-Anne, can you give us your response to how can recovery in Scotland tackle poverty and gender inequality?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, this is one of those other examples of how the inequality that was already in our society has been exacerbated by COVID. We've talked about some of the opportunities tonight where we've seen a way of working as we've come out of COVID by making the best examples of what worked well, like community empowerment, for example. But one of the saddest things I think about the COVID response is how many examples have been seen about how we've lapsed back into gender stereotypes and gender norms, and that's why women have borne the brunt of what's happened during COVID, is because of that lapse and that step backwards for it. So gender equality absolutely does need to be at the heart of how we come out of COVID. That will absolutely involve childcare, and we'll have more to say about that in our manifesto. It's got to absolutely have to do around women returners. That was a policy we had in government previously, but we need to ensure that we're extending that as we move forward. About encouraging and supporting through the Parental Employment Fund, which again has been extended the support that government can give to parents, usually women who are moving back into the labour market for the first time, encouraging women to start up their own business because they are woefully underrepresented in business startups, and it's certainly not for the lack of ability within women. So why is that not happening? What can we do to encourage that? And we also do need to look at caring. You know, I've mentioned childcare, but unpaid carers is another example of where women are overrepresented. And how do we ensure that we're supporting unpaid carers, if they wish to be able to come into the labour market, even if that's part-time, by ensuring that we have a carers assistance package which doesn't penalise people as it does at the moment for attempting to go back into the workplace as we currently do under the UK system, in which we would certainly like to change.
Okay, thank you, Shirley-Anne Somerville. So we've got one final question, and I'm going to pose a challenge and ask that you'll answer this question in a maximum of one sentence, if that's okay. So the final question is, all of Scotland's political parties supported the Child Poverty Act. Will the panellists commit to continuing this spirit of cross-party agreement wherever possible in the next Scottish Parliament, and to making the next Scottish Parliament one that is remembered as the one that turned the tide on poverty in Scotland? Rachael Hamilton first, please, one sentence.
Yes, we will. I mean, anyone who doesn't want to tackle child poverty, tackle the disability employment gap, and support BAME people and tackle gender inequality shouldn't really be standing in the Parliament.
Okay, thanks. Willie, can you manage in one sentence?
It's probably the easiest question of the night. It has to be yes, because I want to be remembered for having tackled this, not failed it.
Okay, thank you. Alison Johnstone, Scottish Greens.
Absolutely. Poverty is not inevitable. We can get together and work constructively to develop the policies. If the political will is there, we can change this. It's not intractable. It is something we can change, and we must all commit to continue to work together to do that.
Thank you. Anna Sarwar, same question, Scottish Labour.
I want us to focus on what unites us, not what divides us. And if we can't unite around challenging child poverty and defeating it, we can't unite on anything else. So absolutely, wholeheartedly, yes.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Shirley-Anne Somerville, SNP.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you will see during an election campaign, we will have different policies and our different manifestos for all the political parties. But what we absolutely have to challenge ourselves once this election is over, no matter what happens, is to get down to supporting this country into recovery and supporting the people of Scotland into moving forward with that. One of the driving ambitions of the next Parliament has to be around tackling child poverty. And we need to come together as a Parliament, as a country, to be able to tackle that. And I hope that we will be able to do that. And I hope that you've heard tonight that at least these panellists are committed to doing that, and I certainly am.
Okay, thank you. Now we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to hand back to Peter Kelly, Director of the Poverty Alliance, just for a few concluding remarks before we wrap up the session tonight. Peter, can I hand over to you?
Thanks very much, Fiona. I should try and be inspired by that last question and be as brief as possible, which notoriously not good for. But I think our debate tonight, the discussion tonight, has been really instructive, and I think it's good to finish on the way that we have, with that sense of unity of purpose across the parties, because that is absolutely what we need. Too often, I think we are divided over some of the detail, and it was heartening during the last Parliament to get that unanimity around the Child Poverty Act. But as I said at the start, what we need is unanimity around some of the actions, at least, to drive forward our ambitions around child poverty and around various other dimensions of poverty, that some of which we discussed tonight. And I think our discussion tonight has been really good in that there was important acknowledgement of the different inequalities dimensions and intersection of inequalities and poverty, and that's something that we want to see much more action on in the next Parliament as well. There were some issues that perhaps I saw in the questions that we didn't get to, and I think that we also need to explore further. So questions around the links between drug harms and drug deaths and poverty, something that are really difficult and really challenging issue, I think, but one, excuse me, again, that needs to really be a real focus for attention in the next Parliament. Similarly, around unpaid carers, I think we've seen the role of care, of social care. We've discussed some aspects of the gendered nature of that care tonight, but I think the role of unpaid carers has become particularly important and a particularly important focus during the pandemic, and that's something that, again, that we've seen some commitments and some discussion of tonight, but we need much more action around in the future. I think I close by saying also really welcome cross-party commitment around the Scottish Child Payment and the doubling of the Scottish Child Payment. It's been an important commitment throughout the last Parliament to get that Scottish Child Payment secured, to see it increase and to see it really become the bedrock of action to really tackle child poverty. I think is really important. So really welcome to see that commitment, but also looking forward to a minimum income guarantee, obviously a key part of the Poverty Alliance manifesto. So good to see the endorsement of that idea and to see how we can flesh out that idea and build on it during the next Parliament, because it's that kind of radicalism, those kind of bold ideas that we need to really make an impact on poverty in Scotland. One thing I would just finish by saying is I posted a link to a Hustings guide that we produced in the last couple of weeks. We want to see these kind of discussions taking place right across Scotland in constituencies right across Scotland, not just with leading party members as we've assembled tonight, but with all candidates right across Scotland. So for anyone who wants to, that guide is there for you to use. We'll provide any support we can. I'd like to just also finish by thanking all of our candidates who've joined us tonight and really participating so fully in our discussion and in a manner that I think should give us hope for taking forward action in the next Parliament. I'd also finally like to thank all of our members who helped develop the manifesto that we launched a couple of weeks ago, in particular to the members of our community activist group, people with experience of poverty who also helped contribute to shaping and framing some of those asks that are in that manifesto. I'll hand back to you now, Fiona, for your closing comments, but just finally, again, thanks to everyone for taking part tonight.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. And I think really that just leaves it to me to also thank all of the panellists for their inputs today and for the answers to all of the questions, and to everyone for watching and participating, and for all the people who submitted questions. It's been really, really helpful. Can I just say, if anyone hasn't already, can I encourage you to read the Poverty Alliance Manifesto, A Scotland for All of Us, and it's available on the Poverty Alliance website. Also, if you haven't already, become a member of the Poverty Alliance. Please sign up and join us to campaign for a Scotland without poverty. So just to say as well, if you would like to watch this again, it is being recorded and the recording will be available on the Poverty Alliance website, and it'll also be circulated around people so that anyone who didn't manage to come along tonight will be able to see what happened and how the proceedings went. So as I say, just a final thanks from me, and a good night to everyone.
Thanks to the chair.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks all. Thank you very much.